Grandparents, what is happening if you have gone from parent to grandparent and now you're back to parenting because you're raising your grandchildren? This is probably one of the questions that pops up most frequently in either our email or on some of our comments. And it's a difficult situation, and there aren't a lot of resources out there for grandparents in this situation. So we want to point you to a couple of studies that have some good information and just maybe will give you some encouragement. One is a RAND study, and we'll put a link to that in the notes around this video. And they even state plainly there's a need for more data, but roughly 5 to 6% of the grandchildren in our country right now live with their grandparents, and they may do so for various reasons. We'll talk about some of those in a few minutes, but they came up with some interesting facts. One is that it's equally common to have split generation households in both urban and rural places, but the makeup of those families is different. In the more urban areas, the families that have multiple generations living in a household are poor and black, and in the rural area, less likely to be poor, but they're more likely to be white families. And so there's some cultural questions that we could ask surrounding those issues, those facts. What are the problems that create a need for grandchildren to be living in the household with their grandparents? Some of those you might guess at: separation and divorce of the parents. In that situation, many times children get lost in the balance and they end up, maybe with grandparents part of the time because of changing economic situations of parents. Unemployment of parents. They now are unemployed and can't afford to raise their children. I think that probably is happening more frequently as we see, high inflation and difficulties making ends meet for many families. Economic issues led right into that, just the difficulties of our time and seeing, how do we make ends meet where the dollar doesn't go as far as it used to. Maybe over the next few years we'll see even more families, not necessarily where grandparents are raising grandchildren, but maybe whole families are living together. And there has been a little bit of a trend of that in the last decade or so anyway. And then of course we have the difficult situation where we've got emotional, drug, or alcohol problems in a generation, and so the children end up getting put into homes with their grandparents. Another interesting article with some data appears on fathermatters.org, and it's 23 statistics on grandparents raising grandchildren. Interesting to read through those and see, a little bit of what's going on. But some of the problems indicated when grandparents are raising grandchildren are these. First of all, economic. Many grandparents, if they're past the point of retirement, they're living on fixed incomes. And we all know from raising our own children are not inexpensive. It costs money. They grow out of clothing quickly. They need, items for school. They need to do activities. And so it's not inexpensive to raise children. And when grandparents who are on a fixed income and may be struggling already now have the added responsibility of raising their grands, there's some economic pressure put on in those situations. And grandparents need information on resources that might be available in their communities to help them. Some of my recommendations would be to start calling government agencies, start calling local counseling centers, call churches, find out what is available in your community to help, whether it's government assistance or maybe some shared babysitting through a church group. Who knows? You might find all kinds of things available in your community that aren't advertised necessarily, but they're services that people in your community are offering. And then another thing that this study found was that grandchildren will tend to have good emotional development living with grandparents, but they tend to fall behind in their academics. And maybe some reasons indicated for that. Some of it would be maybe their school life has been disrupted by changes, moving from school to school. But also, and I know this as a grandparent, you see differences in the education since we were kids. First of all, the quantity of what children are studying earlier in life is fairly amazing. The facts are exploding in our world today. We have access to so much more information, and our children start their school life with that access. They start their school life, or our grandchildren, they start their school life with computers in hand. My grands carry tablets to school, and they're issued by the school. It's how they access their homework. It's how they access most of their textbooks. It's just a very different world from what most of us lived through in our schooling days. And so it's hard for grandparents to keep up with that. Again, I would suggest go to the schools, find out what help they can offer in either, training for the adults who are helping the children. How do I use this tablet? How do I access the information? Maybe they offer some evening training on that. Or maybe they have, counselors in school who will help the children with the difficulties they have. Look for resources. Don't frustrate. Don't allow the child to, fall even more behind because you're afraid to ask for help. One of the hardest things to do, yes, but sometimes we just need to ask. And then, of course, one of the other problems indicated when grandparents are raising grandchildren is behavioral problems. Children who have been shuffled around from home to home, or who have lived in a home with parents who are abusive or are abusing drugs or alcohol, they come with some baggage generally. And that can be in part because of the problems with their parents and the broken promises of their parents. Children tend to want to believe the best of their parents even when they've lived through some really horrendous experiences. And if we're grandparents raising those children, we just need to be prepared to anticipate that, and then again get help where we can find it when we need it. Don't assume this is the way it has to be because your grandchild grew up with some difficulties. Work hard to make it, to improve their situation, to help them understand, and to give them the love and support. Remember the first statistic, or the first indicator that I mentioned, that emotional development living with grandparents tends to be overall pretty good for grands. So that tells us that love makes a difference, okay? Our love for those grandchildren, even with economic factors or social factors, love does make a difference, and if we can play on that, we might change the course of their lives. So a couple of other recommendations, if you find yourself in this spot, is, tune into modern culture as much as you can. Is it different than what we grew up with? Yes. But your grandchildren need help understanding it and navigating it. And if you are the parent, you need to navigate it and help them understand what's going on around them, whether you agree or not. And I'm not at all saying you have to agree with modern culture, but you do need to help your grandchildren navigate it. They will come home, or your grandchildren, they will come home with questions and difficulties. It's, to us, the world may look a little strange right now, but it's their normal every day working with peers and trying to figure out how to be the person that they were created to be. So help them out. Tune in, get assistance where you can. Call state agencies or local counseling centers and ask what programs are available for free if possible. And if you can afford to pay for counseling, then certainly don't be too ashamed to take it, because you may need it if you're raising grands in our modern culture. And finally, just don't give up. Look at these precious children. In situations like this, they're the innocents. They did not ask to be in, difficult circumstances in homes with parents who are doing drugs or committing crimes. They didn't ask for any of that. They're a child. They're relying on the adults around them to train them up and teach them how to be adults. If we have to step in, grandparents, do your best. Don't give up. Remember the value of that little soul. That little person's whole future may be set by their experience with you. And so make it the best you can. Be grand.